"It's too cold to sleep," the 88-year-old widow whispered, standing in thin slippers inside her freezing home. The thermostat still glowed. The bills were paid. But when a scarred biker brushed snow off the outside power box, he found an orange seal that was never supposed to be there. "It's too cold to sleep," the 88-year-old widow whispered through the cracked front door, and Grady Larkspur stopped with one boot still on the snowy porch. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in northern Missouri, cold enough for the pine branches to click like old bones against the roof. The porch light above her head blinked twice, weak and yellow, showing her thin white hair, her pale hands wrapped around the collar of a faded blue robe, and the little cloud of breath leaving her mouth. Something was wrong. Grady had only turned on a Pine Hollow road because the highway was icing over and his 2009 Harley-Davidson Road King needed fuel from the last open pump 9 miles back. He was 61, broad as a doorframe, with a gray beard, a scar running from his left temple toward his cheek, and a black leather vest that made strangers step aside before he ever spoke. But the old woman did not step back from him. She simply held the door with trembling fingers and looked embarrassed, as if being cold in her own house was somehow poor manners. Behind her, the room was dark except for a small table lamp, a battery weather radio, and the green glow of a thermostat on the wall reading 49 degrees. Grady smelled dust, old cedar, weak peppermint tea, and the sharp metallic bite of a house that had been cold too long. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low, "is your heat out?" The widow blinked slowly. "It says it's on." She turned her head toward the hallway, as if the furnace might answer for itself. "I paid it, $38.72 last week." I wrote it down. Grady looked past her shoulder and saw a ceramic mug on the kitchen table, a folded quilt pulled over the back of a chair, and a pair of thin slippers placed near a floor vent that gave nothing but silence. No warm air, no low hum, no ticking pipes, just wind pressing at the windows. The old woman tried to smile, but her chin shook too hard to hold it. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she said. That sentence landed heavier than the cold. Grady glanced down the narrow road. 6 small homes sat under snow, each porch light dimmed, each driveway buried. No one was outside. No one had noticed the 88-year-old widow standing awake near midnight because sleeping had become colder than standing. "What's your name?" he asked. "Florence Pember." She straightened a little when she said it, as if dignity was the last blanket she had left. Grady nodded once. "Florence, I'm going to look at that heater." She opened the door wider, and the cold inside rolled out to meet the cold outside. He stepped in, careful not to crowd her, careful not to make his sighs the loudest thing in the room. On the wall, the thermostat still glowed. On the table, the weather radio warned of a low of 12 degrees by morning. And somewhere outside, under a crust of snow near the side porch, a small locked box waited in the dark. Grady closed the door behind him with 2 fingers, gentle enough not to rattle the glass, and the house seemed to shrink around the cold. Florence stayed near the entryway, one hand pressed to the wall for balance, her robe hanging loose over her shoulders. He could hear the tiny sound of her teeth touching together. 3 quick taps. 1 pause. The living room was no bigger than a motel office, maybe 12 feet across, with brown carpet worn flat near the chair, a narrow bookshelf, and a framed wedding photo turned slightly toward a lamp with a crooked shade. The thermostat on the wall said heat, but the vent below, it breathed nothing. Grady crouched beside it and held his scarred hand over the metal grate. No warmth, not even a weak draft. "When did it stop?" he asked. Florence looked toward the kitchen clock. It was 11:53 now, the red numbers sharp in the dim room. "Monday night, I think. It got quiet after supper." "You call the office?" "Tuesday morning." She swallowed. "They said it was a safety check." Grady stood slowly, letting that answer settle. Outside, the wind scraped snow against the siding. Inside, the silence of the furnace felt too complete, like something had been shut off on purpose. He moved through the room without touching more than he had to. A cup of peppermint tea sat on the table, cold enough to form a dull skin on top. Beside it lay a pencil, a grocery list with 3 items, and and a small notebook opened to careful handwriting. Heat fee, $38.72. Paid Friday. 2:15 p.m. Florence noticed him looking and pulled the notebook closer, embarrassed. I keep track because people think I forget. Grady's face tightened, but his voice stayed calm. That's smart. She gave a weak nod. My Lawrence used to say, numbers remember when people don't. Grady did not answer right away. He saw the way she said her husband's name without asking for pity, the way the house still held him in small places. A fishing cap on a nail, a coffee tin full of screws, a pair of reading glasses folded beside the radio. This was not a woman who had simply ignored her heat. This was a woman trying to prove she had done everything right. Grady checked the kitchen window. Latched. He checked the back door, sealed with a rolled towel against a draft. He checked the breaker panel in the hallway, an old gray box with a faded inspection sticker from 1998. The switches were on. Nothing looked tripped. Florence followed 3 steps behind him, breathing carefully, as if moving too fast would waste heat she did not have. Maybe I pushed the wrong button, she said. Maybe I made it worse. No, Grady said. One word, firm enough to stop the shame before it could grow. He returned to the living room and looked again at the thermostat. A cheap plastic model, beige from age, still glowing with borrowed confidence. It clicked when he raised the temperature from 68 to 72. Somewhere below the floor, nothing answered. No ferniskik, no blowe, no pipenak. Just the radio whispering about frostbite warnings for Boone and Mercer counties. Wind chill near zero. After 3 a.m. Grady turned toward the window beside the side porch. Snow had drifted high against the steps. Beyond it, half hidden behind a leaning shrub, he saw the outline of an exterior utility box mounted low on the wall. A thin strip of orange caught the porch light. Too bright for rust. Too straight for accident. Florence saw where he was looking and lowered her voice. A woman from the office put something there. Grady's eyes stayed on the orange strip. When Tuesday, Florence said. She told me not to touch it. The room went still around them. Grady reached for his gloves, the leather stiff from the ride, and pulled them on one finger at a time. Then he took the small flashlight from his vest pocket and walked toward the side door, leaving Florence near the lamp, wrapped in the only warm thing the house had left, the hope that someone had finally started to look closely. The side door opened with a tired groan, and the storm stepped in before Grady stepped out. Snow blew across his boots in thin white ribbons, piling against the threshold and melting in dark spots on the worn linoleum. Florence stood behind him with both hands wrapped around the edge of her robe, watching like a person afraid the cold had an answer waiting outside. Grady turned back once. Lock this behind me until I knock. She hesitated. You'll freeze out there. I've been colder. He said it softly, without pride, then eased the door shut between them. The porch was narrow, 6 boards wide, with a sagging rail and a plastic chair tipped on its side under 2 inches of snow. His 2009 Road King sat near the road, its chrome dulled by frost, its engine ticking down in the dark. Across Pine Hollow Road, one house had a television flickering blue behind curtains. Another had a porch bulb swinging loose in the wind. Nobody opened a door. Nobody asked why a large scarred biker was kneeling beside an old widow's wall at nearly midnight. Grady crouched near the utility box and brushed snow away with his glove. The orange strip was not a warning tag from the power company. It was a cheap adhesive seal, the kind sold in office packs, pressed across the latch as if it carried authority just because it was bright. He leaned closer and smelled wet paper, cold metal, and the faint, oily scent of fresh tape glue. Fresh, not Monday old, not weather-worn. He shined a flashlight along the siding. 3 footprints stood near the box, partly filled with powder smaller than his, with a narrow heel pattern. They came from the direction of the office lane, not from Florence's walkway. One set in, one set out. No service truck tracks, no ladder marks. Grady pulled out his phone and took 3 photos. One close, one wide, one with a window and porch light in frame. Then a porch door creaked across the road. A man in a red flannel coat stepped out, holding a trash bag like an excuse. Everything all right over there? He called. Grady stood, keeping his hands visible. Her heat's been off since Monday. The man frowned but did not cross the road. Office said it was a safety inspection. You see anyone inspect it? The man looked at the snow, then at the orange seal. Glenna came by Tuesday morning. 10, maybe 10:30. Had a clipboard. Anyone else? No truc. The man's voice dropped. But Florence gets confused sometimes. Grady's eyes lifted from the box. Not angry. Not loud. Just steady enough to make the man regret the sentence before it froze between them. She remembered $38.72. She remembered Friday at 2:15. She remembered Tuesday morning. Sounds like everybody else forgot. The man said nothing. From inside the house, Florence's small face appeared at the side window, pale behind the glass. Grady looked back at the seal, then at the latch beneath it. He could break it in 2 seconds. He could restore heat before anyone finished arguing. But if he tore it now, Glenna could call it tampering, blame Florence, and bury the truth under another form. So he did the slower thing, the harder thing. He photographed the seal again, wiped snow from the serial plate below the box, and read the model number in his phone. Coleman EB15B, manufactured for mobile home heating, 240 volts, old but common. Then he called a man named Curtis from a repair shop 17 miles away and said exactly 6 words. Elderly widow. No heat. Need witness. The wind shoved at his back. The orange seal snapped once in the cold. And behind the window, Florence stood perfectly still, as if one more person finally believing her had warmed the room by a single degree. At 12:28 a.m., Grady knocked twice on the side door, and Florence unlocked it with fingers that looked too small for the brass knob. He stepped inside with snow on his shoulders and did not shake it off until he was back on the mat. The house had not warmed. The thermostat still glowed with the same little lie. The weather radio clicked, hissed, and repeated the advisory in a flat county voice. Exposed skin could freeze in minutes. After 3 a.m., Florence looked toward the sidewall. Did I do something wrong? Grady took off his gloves slowly. No, one word. Enough to hold the room steady. He went to the hard saddlebag on his Road King and returned with a folded emergency blanket. Before Curtis reached Pine Hollow Road, Grady sent one more message. Bring a portable heater and a rated orange cord from the repair van. A few minutes later, headlights crawled across the curtains. A white repair van rolled into the lane, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Curtis Wainwright climbed out wearing insulated coveralls, a knit cap, and the expression of a man who had been pulled from sleep but understood why. He was 56, white-bearded, with a tool bag in one hand and a thermometer in the other. From the back of the van, he brought a small ceramic heater and a rated orange cord. The heater was dented on one corner, the kind a repairman keeps for bad nights, but the cord was clean and thick. Grady checked the outlet near the kitchen first, then Curtis checked the plug and the distance from the curtains. Grady moved a stack of old newspapers away from the wall, while Curtis placed the heater on the tile and turned it to low. A thin red glow appeared behind the grill. Florence stared at it, as if it were a fireplace in a mansion. I can pay you, she said quickly. I have cash in a jar. Keep the jar. But electricity costs money. So who does ignoring people? Grady said it quietly, then looked away so she would not feel corrected. The first weak ribbon of warm air pushed across the floor. It smelled like dust burning off old coils, warm plastic, and the faint peppermint from her forgotten tea. Florence lowered herself into the chair with both hands on the armrests, careful, proud, unwilling to collapse in front of a stranger. Grady draped the blanket over her knees without tucking it too tight. He left her room to breathe. Curtis looked around the freezing room, then back at Grady. This her place? He asked. Grady nodded. Don't break the seal yet. Curtis raised an eyebrow. That bad. That's strange. They went back outside together while Florence watched from the window, the blanket rising and falling with her careful breaths. Curtis photographed the orange strip, the latch, the footprints, and the serial plate. He tested the exterior line without opening the box, then checked the breaker panel inside, the thermostat wiring, and the furnace access under the hallway vent. Every reading told the same story. Power inside. Control inside. Heat blocked outside. At 12:41, Curtis stood in the living room and rubbed his jaw. This system didn't fail by itself. Florence looked down at her hands. The office said it was for safety. Curtis glanced at Grady, then back at her. Ma'am, a real safety shutoff gets logged with a work order and a technician number. This has neither. The red flannel neighbor had crossed the road by then and stood just inside the doorway, boots dripping onto the mat, his face pinched with shame. Another woman from 2 houses down arrived carrying a stainless travel mug of hot broth and a bag of hand warmers from her car. The room filled slowly, not with noise, but with witnesses. Florence kept apologizing for the trouble. Each time, someone told her to stop. Grady said the least. He stood by the window, looking past the porch light toward the small management office at the end of Pine Hollow Road. One window was still lit. One car sat outside it, and in the snow between that office and Florence's house, the narrow heel prints made a pale trail that had not yet disappeared. At 12:49 a.m., Grady asked Florence if she still had the notice from the office, and she looked ashamed before she even answered. "I keep papers too long," she said, as if careful records were another weakness people had taught her to hide. She pointed toward the narrow kitchen, where a drawer under the silverware tray stuck halfway open from swollen wood. The neighbor woman helped her stand, but Florence waved her off after 2 steps, determined to cross her own kitchen in her own house. 3 slow steps, 1 breath. Grady stayed behind her, close enough to catch her if she slipped, far enough not to steal her dignity. The drawer scraped open with a dry wooden cough. Inside were rubber bands, old batteries, church envelopes, appliance manuals, and a neat stack of folded notices held together with a black binder clip. Florence pulled out the newest one and placed it on the table under the lamp. The paper smelled faintly of cold ink and kitchen flour, as if it had sat beside bread dough earlier that week. Across the top was the management office name. Below it, a printed line said Temporary Safety Inspection. The date was Tuesday. The time window was 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. The handwritten initials at the bottom were small, slanted, and pressed so hard the pen had dented the page. Grady did not read it aloud. He simply took a photo, then slid the notice toward Curtis. Curtis compared it to the orange seal photo on Grady's phone and gave a low whistle through his teeth. "This is not a utility tag," he said. "This is office supply tape pretending to be authority." The red flannel neighbor stared at the paper. "Glenna handed those out?" Florence folded her hands. "She told me it would be safer not to touch anything until morning." "Which morning?" Grady asked. Florence looked confused by the question, then the answer hurt her face. She didn't say. For a moment, the only sound was the heater clicking on low and the wind dragging snow along the siding. Then the neighbor woman set the travel mug near Florence and said she had received no such notice. The red flannel man checked his phone and said he had not either. Curtis stepped outside again and called the county utility emergency line from the porch, putting the conversation on speaker while Grady recorded the time, 12:57 a.m. The emergency operator confirmed there was no active utility shutoff order and no technician dispatch listed for Florence's address that week. Florence sat very still when she heard that, her eyes fixed not on the phone, but on the folded notice in front of her. She had spent 3 nights blaming her memory, her age, her hands, her thermostat, even the way she spoke to the office. Now the room was quietly proving that her only mistake had been believing someone who sounded official. Grady saw her shoulders begin to fold inward. He reached for the notice, not touching her, only moving the paper out of the center of her sight. "You didn't misunderstand," he said. Florence swallowed. Then why would she do that? Nobody answered at first. The question was too plain to soften. Curtis cleared his throat and pointed toward the management office through the frosted window. "There's one person awake who can explain." Grady looked at the clock over the stove. 1:03 a.m. The numbers glowed red against the yellowed wall. He zipped his leather jacket, picked up the photos, the notice, and Curtis's written reading from the thermometer. Interior 49 degrees, exterior utility access sealed, furnace circuit blocked. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He only looked at the 2 neighbors and said, "Stay with her." Florence reached for the edge of the table. "Mr. Larkspur, please don't make trouble." Grady paused at the door and turned back, his scar pale under the kitchen light. "Ma'am," he said, "trouble already came here. I'm just walking it back to the right porch." Then he stepped into the storm, with Curtis beside him and two sets of footprints following the narrow heel marks toward the office light. The walk to the management office was only 140 yards, but the storm made it feel like crossing a field at the edge of the world. Grady went first, boots breaking the crust, shoulders hunched against the wind. Curtis followed with his tool bag banging against his knee, and the red flannel neighbor came behind them, silent now, his trash bag forgotten on Florence's porch like a weak excuse left behind. 3 men. 1 light. The office sat at the end of Pine Hollow Road in a low brown building with vinyl siding and a plastic wreath still hanging from December, even though Christmas had passed 26 days ago. A silver 2016 Chevrolet Malibu sat beside the ramp, its hood dusted with snow, but its windshield recently cleared. Someone was inside. Through the blinds, Grady saw movement near a desk lamp, then the sharp blue blink of a computer screen. He knocked once. Firm, not loud. The blinds parted. Glenna Pritchard's face appeared between 2 slats, pale and irritated, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She opened the door only 6 inches. Warm air slipped out around her, smelling of printer toner, vanilla room spray, and burnt coffee. "Office hours are over," she said. Grady held up the folded notice without stepping closer. "Florence Pember's heat is off." Glenna looked past him toward Curtis and the neighbor. "That unit is under safety review." "By who?" Curtis asked. Glenna's mouth tightened. "Maintenance." "Name?" 1 word from Grady. Glenna blinked. "Excuse me?" "The technician's name." She opened the door wider, not from welcome, but from a need to sound in charge. The office behind her was small and overheated, with a wall calendar, a corkboard of payment reminders, and a desk stacked with manila folders. A little digital heater glowed under her desk, set to 74. Grady noticed it. So did Curtis. Glenna folded her arms. "Mrs. Pember has had repeated issues understanding service instructions." The red flannel neighbor flinched at that. Grady placed the notice on the counter between them. Then Curtis placed his thermal reading beside it. Then Grady set his phone down, screen open to the orange seal photo with the timestamp, 12:21 a.m. The 3 pieces of proof sat in a straight line under the fluorescent light. Paper, reading, photo. Glenna did not touch any of them. "That seal is not from the utility company," Curtis said. "There's no county work order. No technician dispatch. Nothing in the system that explains this." Glenna gave a small laugh, too thin to survive the room. "You woke people up over a clerical delay?" Grady's eyes stayed steady. An 88-year-old woman was sitting in a 49-degree house. "She exaggerates. The meter doesn't." The office went quiet except for the hum of Glenna's underdesk heater. Outside, snow rattled against the window like thrown sand. Glenna reached for the notice, but Grady slid it back just an inch. "Not aggressive. Careful. Don't change the paper," he said. Her face hardened. "Are you threatening me?" "No, 1 word. Flat as frozen ground. I'm asking why your handwriting is on a shut-off notice that nobody filed." The red flannel neighbor finally spoke. "You told us it was official." Glenna turned on him fast. "I told residents there were inspections." "Not me," he said. "Not my house." Curtis looked toward the corkboard behind her desk. Near the paper cutter, a torn orange backing strip lay half-covered by a parking flyer, the same color as the seal on Florence's box. Grady saw it. Glenna saw him see it. For the first time, her confidence moved. Just a fraction. Enough. Grady took 1 photo of the corkboard from where he stood, with the notice and thermal reading still visible on the counter. Glenna's voice dropped. "You have no right to photograph private office materials." Curtis answered before Grady could. "When private office materials are being used to leave a widow without heat in a freeze warning, somebody better start documenting." Glenna looked toward the door, as if the cold outside had suddenly become safer than the warm office. Grady picked up the notice, but left the photo open on his phone. "We're going back now," he said. "You can bring the key now, or I can call the county dispatcher and read them every note before 1:20. Glenna stared at him, then at the men behind him, then at the torn orange backing strip near her own paper cutter. Her hand moved slowly toward the locked cabinet under the counter. The key ring inside jingled once. And for the first time that night, the sound of metal did not belong to another excuse. Glenna walked behind them with the key ring hidden in her coat pocket, but every few steps the metal clicked against her hip and gave her away. It was 1:17 a.m. when they reached Florence's side porch again, and the wind had sharpened until it pushed tears from the corners of Curtis's eyes. The orange seal on the utility box snapped in the gusts, bright and false under Grady's flashlight. Inside the house, Florence sat in the chair with the canvas blanket over her knees, the neighbor woman beside her, and the red glow of the small heater Curtis had brought from his repair van, painting the floor in a circle of borrowed warmth. She looked up when Glenna entered. Not angry, not dramatic, just tired in a way that made the room ashamed for her. Glenna kept her voice businesslike. "Mrs. Pember, there seems to have been a processing issue." Florence's fingers tightened around the travel mug. "Processing issue?" Grady stood near the wall, saying nothing. Curtis set his tool bag down with a heavy thud. The red flannel neighbor stayed by the door, hat in his hands. 3 witnesses. One lie running out of places to stand. Glenna removed the key ring and chose a small brass key with a red plastic sleeve. "We will restore the unit pending review." Curtis looked at Grady. Grady looked at the key. "Pending nothing," Curtis said. "I'm checking the line now, and if it's safe, it stays on." Glenna's jaw worked once, but she did not argue. They went back outside together. Florence did not follow, but her eyes stayed fixed on the side window, watching shapes move through the blowing snow. Glenna cut the orange seal with a small office knife from her pocket. Curtis photographed that too. The adhesive peeled away with a wet tearing sound, leaving sticky strips on the metal latch. Behind it, the access box opened cleanly. No marks, no melted wire, no tripped emergency fuse. Only a service disconnect pulled down and locked out. Curtis tested it twice, reading numbers under his breath. 238 volts available, line intact, no ground fault. "This was not a failed heater," he said. "It was shut off." The words crossed the porch and seemed to enter the house before anyone did. Florence lowered her head. Glenna stared at the snow. "It was supposed to be temporary," she said. Grady turned his flashlight toward the ground so it would not be in her face. 3 nights. I had concerns about the unit. Then you call a licensed technician. Curtis reset the disconnect and secured the cover properly. You don't leave a woman in January with a paper notice and no heat. Glenna looked smaller now, but not sorry enough. That assessment was still unpaid, Glenna said, then stopped as if she had heard herself too late. The sentence came out thin, almost unwilling. There it was. Not safety, not confusion, not an old woman making mistakes. A $19.50 disputed fee, buried under office language, had become 3 nights of cold. Grady's face did not change, and that made him more frightening than shouting ever could. He stepped closer only enough for Glenna to hear him under the wind. You don't collect a debt from someone's bones. Curtis flipped the system back on at 1:26 a.m. From inside the house came the first low rumble beneath the floor, uncertain at first, then steady. Avanti, kid. A pipe knocked once. Florence lifted her face toward the sound like she had heard a voice she thought was gone. Glenna opened her mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to protect herself, but the red flannel neighbor spoke before she could. I saw you Tuesday, he said. I'll say that. The neighbor woman added from inside, and I heard the utility line confirm there was no order. Grady looked at Glenna, then toward the road where the management office light still burned uselessly in the snow. Tomorrow morning, he said, this goes to the county housing office. Tonight, she gets warm. No one moved for a second. Then Curtis carried his tools back inside, and warm air finally began to push through Florence's floor vent. By 1:34 a.m., the house had begun to remember what warmth felt like. It did not happen all at once. First came the low metal hum beneath the hallway, then a soft push of air through the floor vent, then the slow ticking of pipes that had been silent for 3 nights. Florence sat very still, as if moving might frighten the heat away. Curtis's small heater glowed beside the kitchen, but now it was no longer the only defense between her and the storm. Curtis knelt by the vent with his thermometer and watched the numbers climb. 51 degrees, then 53, then 55. Not comfortable yet, but alive. The neighbor woman wrapped another blanket around Florence's shoulders and handed her the travel mug again. The broth had gone lukewarm, smelling of chicken, black pepper, and celery salt, but Florence held it like a blessing. "I thought I was becoming foolish," she whispered. "I kept thinking maybe I forgot a switch." Grady stood near the window, his gloves tucked under one arm, snow melting from his boots into a dark crescent on the rug. "You didn't forget." 3 words. 1 repair. Glenna remained near the side door, key ring in her hand, no longer trying to sound official. The red flannel neighbor looked at the floor more than at Florence. "I should have checked," he said. His voice was rough. "I saw your light on every night." Florence turned toward him with the tired kindness of someone who had spent a lifetime forgiving before being asked. "People have their own troubles," she said. That made him look worse, not better. Curtis shut his tool bag and wrote his service note on a yellow invoice pad. Emergency heat restored. Exterior disconnect found locked. No utility order present. No equipment failure at time of inspection. He tore off the top sheet and placed it beside Florence's notebook. "Keep this," he said. "Make 2 copies in the morning." Glenna flinched at that, but said nothing. Grady noticed. He always noticed the silence people chose. At 1:48 a.m., the thermostat clicked again, and the furnace answered immediately. Florence heard it and closed her eyes. Not sleep. Not yet. Just relief finally reaching a body that had been holding itself tight for too long. The neighbor woman went to the kitchen and warmed the peppermint tea in a small saucepan because the microwave button stuck. The smell rose again, sweeter now, mixing with warm dust from the vents and the clean, wet scent of thawing snow by the door. Grady stepped outside once more, not to confront anyone, not to search for another clue, but to clear the side steps with an old metal shovel leaning against the railing. Each scrape was slow and practical. Ice off the first step, snow off the second, salt from a cracked plastic bucket near the wall. When he came back in, Florence was watching him with a look he did not know how to accept. "You ride with those men people warn us about," she said softly. The room went quiet. Grady looked down at his vest, at the unreadable patches blurred by age and road grime, then back at her. Sometimes warnings miss a few details. Florence almost smiled. Almost. Then she reached for her notebook and wrote the time with a shaking hand. 1:56 a.m. Heat came back. She underlined it once. The house was still old. The storm was still outside. Glenna still had questions to answer when daylight came. But for the first time that night, Florence's breath no longer showed in the room, and the sound under the floor was not silence anymore. At 2:07 a.m., Curtis finished his final reading and showed Florence the meter so she could see the proof with her own eyes, 61 degrees and rising. The number was not just warmth. It was an answer. Grady placed the orange seal, the office notice, Curtis's service note, and the photo timestamps in a clear plastic kitchen sleeve from Florence's drawer, then set them beside her notebook. Glenna stood by the door with her coat buttoned wrong, looking toward the floor vent as if the heat itself had become a witness against her. "I will correct the account in the morning," she said. Florence looked up. Her voice was weak, but not confused. Was it because of the $19.50? Nobody had told her that number yet. Glenna's face changed. The red flannel neighbor lifted his head. Curtis stopped winding his cord. Florence reached into her notebook and turned back 2 pages. There was in her careful handwriting, maintenance assessment, $19.50, disputed, asked for explanation. She had questioned a fee she did not understand, and someone with a warm office had answered by making her colder than she had ever been in her own home. That was why. Not a broken furnace. Not an unpaid heat bill. Not age. Not memory. Not a safety inspection. A widow had shivered for 3 nights because someone with a warm office had treated a disputed $19.50 fee like it mattered more than an old woman's safety. Grady did not move toward Glenna. He did not need to. The truth had crossed the room without raising its voice. "You'll write that correction now," he said. Glenna opened her mouth, then closed it, then wrote a dated acknowledgement that the heat had been restored. The disputed $19.50 fee would be removed pending review, and no official utility shutoff order had been presented that night. Curtis took a photo of it. The neighbors added their names and phone numbers as witnesses. At 2:22 a.m., Glenna left without another explanation, her steps small in the snow where earlier heel prints had nearly vanished. By morning, the county housing office would have copies, along with Curtis's service report and the neighbors' statements. The neighbors would have a harder time pretending porch lights were none of their business. But that night, the only thing Florence cared about was the warm air moving across her slippers. She sat in her chair, both hands around the mug of peppermint tea, watching the window slowly fog at the edges. Grady picked up his gloves and moved toward the door. "Mr. Larkspur," she said. He stopped. "I wasn't foolish." He turned back, scar pale under the lamp, and gave one slow nod. "No, ma'am. You were cold." Florence looked down at the notebook in her lap, at the underlined time when heat came back, and breathed out without seeing her breath. Outside, the storm kept moving through the pines. Inside, an old house made its ordinary sounds again. A vent ticking, a kettle cooling, a floorboard settling under warm air. Grady rode away before sunrise, leaving no speech behind, only tire tracks through the snow and a front porch cleared down to the wood. Florence slept at 3:11 a.m., not because the world had become fair, but because one man had believed her before the cold could finish making her doubt herself. If you believe in the true brotherhood and kindness of bikers, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.